You know, you come to this channel and we're talking about bourbon and rye and scotch, single malt, Irish, Japanese, all this stuff. And if you're new, do you ever kind of just stop and say, hold on, what the is whiskey? Hey everybody, it's Matt. Wrestling with Whiskey is back once again. And if you are here and you like what you see and what you hear, and even if you don't, I'm going to punch you through the camera. By all means, please leave a like down below, subscribe, and if you do, hit that bell so you know every single time a video goes live. So what is whiskey? Before we can get into all the particular types, we got to know what it is. Well, luckily, that's a relatively simple process, a relatively simple definition. Because what whiskey is this. Whiskey essentially is a spirit distilled from malted grain, especially barley or rye. Basically, any cereal grain really is how I was always taught. A spirit distilled from a cereal grain, like corn, wheat, barley, rye, etc. And so now is where you start asking the questions, right? That's pretty simple. But then, vodka can be made with wheat or rye or corn. So why isn't that considered whiskey? And why isn't rum? Why isn't tequila? What are those? And we'll go through that a little bit. So when you're figuring out the basis of a spirit, it does come down to what that base ingredient is. So for whiskey, it is those cereal grains. They pretty much has to be made exclusively of one or more of those cereal grains. Whereas vodka, while it can use cereal grains to be made, vodka can be any starch that is distilled, and often distilled multiple times over and over until it's pure as snow. Then you take something like rum, which needs to be distilled from sugarcane. Then you take tequila, which has to be agave, and so on and so forth. It all comes down to those base ingredients. So that's it. Whiskey, cereal grain. We're done with the video, right? Wrong. Because now you're asking, well, wait, if that's what whiskey is, then why do we have bourbon? And why do we have scotch? And why do we have Irish? And why do we have Japanese? And so on and so forth. Aren't they all whiskey? The answer is yes. But they're different types because they all have different rules. So the three main ones I'm going to talk about today are the most commonly consumed whiskeys that we talk about on this show and often around the world, which are bourbon, scotch, and Irish whiskey. So let's take a look at bourbon. Bourbon became an official designation of whiskey on May 4th, 1964, when Congress recognized bourbon as a distinct product of the United States. And it set forth the rules by which bourbon must be made. So bourbon is an exclusively American style of whiskey. Bourbon must be made from a mash bill of at least 51% corn as an ingredient, has to be distilled to no more than 160 proof, put into the barrel at no more than 125 proof, aged in new charred oak containers. This article says barrels, and their barrels are pretty much always used, but technically, by law, you could use any charred oak container. You could do a box if you wanted, but you'd be an idiot. If bourbon has met all of those previous requirements and has been aged for 2 years, you can be called straight bourbon. But keep in mind, bourbon does not have to be straight. The minute it touches that new charred oak wood, it is bourbon. Even if you pour it in and pour it out 30 seconds later. I'm looking at you, Pabst whiskey. If bourbon is aged less than 4 years at all, you have to state the age on the label. And if there is an age on the label, it has to be the youngest whiskey in there. So if it's a blend of 4 to 9 year whiskey, even though you might have 70% 9-year whiskey, you have to put 4 years on the bottle. You have to denote the youngest age in the bottle. And of course, only whiskey produced in the United States, not just Kentucky, can be called bourbon. That's what we talk about a ton on this show. It has a lot of federal rules. No coloring, no additives. The only thing you can add to bourbon is water. So we're pretty strict about how we make our bourbon here. Very proud of it. Let's take a look at some of the other popular whiskeys in the world. Let's take a look at Irish whiskey. So the Irish Whiskey Act of 1980 defined the basic requirements for Irish whiskey. It must be made from a mash of malted barley, plus other cereal grains are optional. It must be mashed, fermented, and distilled to no more than 94.8 ABV and matured in wooden casks. Notice it didn't say new. In Irish whiskey, you can use used casks, not exceeding 700 liters for a minimum of 3 years in the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland. It cannot contain additives other than coloring and water. So Irish whiskey does allow some coloring and has to be bottled at no less than 40% ABV or 80 proof. So a little bit of a different kind of definition there for Irish whiskey. And then there's Scotch whiskey, one of the most popular forms of whiskey on the planet. Now, Scotland has been making whiskey for a long time, so they have some pretty extensive rules. Take a look. You may notice some of these are similar to Irish whiskey. Obviously, Scotch whiskey must be made in Scotland. It has been distilled at a distillery in Scotland from water and malted barley, to which only other grains, whole grains of other cereals may be added, all of which have been processed at that distillery into the mash, fermented on site at that distillery, and converted into fermentable mash at that distillery. Has been matured in oak casks, again, not new, can be used. Has been matured only in Scotland, much like Irish, has been matured for a period of no less than 3 years, and has been matured only in an excise warehouse or a permitted place by Scottish law. It retains the color, aroma, and taste derived from the raw materials used in the production of the whiskey, and no substance has been added other than water, plain caramel coloring, or both. So again, Scotch does allow a little bit of coloring in some of its bottles, and has a minimum alcoholic strength, much like Irish, of 40% ABV or 80 proof. So as you can see, whiskeys all kind of have their different rules. They all boil down to the same thing, though. That first definition we saw. An alcoholic spirit distilled from a cereal grain, usually barley or rye, but can include corn, wheat, and others. But what you do with it, or what certain nations do with it after that, is up to them. Enjoy your whiskey wherever it comes from and however it's made.